All right, we are going to look at one concept, maybe in a little more detail than we've talked about before, and then introduce you a little bit to taxes. So the thing that I want to make sure everyone's able to do is talk about community surplus, which is consumer surplus and producer surplus added together. When we get to looking at the value or the pros of a free market in comparison to some of the market failures, which we will get to, one of the things that we talk about is the efficiency at which the market provides goods. It's good for us as consumers, but it's also good for producers. When you end up at market equilibrium, where quantity supplied exactly equals quantity demanded, some nice things happen. Generally speaking, we say that it provides a lot of utility, right, to both consumers and producers. In fact, we would say it provides the most utility to both. Right? And so the way you can measure that is by looking at what people would be willing to spend versus what they have to spend. So if our demand curve is downward sloping, okay, by sort of the nature of it being downward sloping, what it implies is there are people, regardless of what this good is, they'd be willing and able to spend way up here that don't have to. And even here, people would be willing and able to spend more but don't have to, because where supply and demand meet, where quantity supplied exactly equals quantity demanded, that creates price. So the area that is below the demand curve, yet above price, okay, is extra for us. Okay? It's extra utility, so to speak. We call that consumer surplus. And I've joked in a couple of the classes, none of us go into a store where we think something's going to be $100, find out it's $75, and still give the cashier $100. You walk out extra happy. That's what this area in orange is. Right. On the flip side, there are producers, by the very nature of being upward sloping, that are willing and able to supply something at a low price. Not many, but there's some. Okay, all the way up until the point at which we see quantity supplied equal quantity demanded. So the area below price, yet above the supply curve, okay, this area in green right here, okay, we call producer surplus. You can think of utility for producers as well. Right, they're gaining extra. And so this is producer surplus. When we add them both together, we call that community surplus. And one of the positives of allowing supply and demand to meet in a free market is that we maximize community surplus. Anytime you intervene in the market, okay, whether that is a price floor set above market equilibrium, a price ceiling set below market equilibrium, or a quantity control set to the left of quantity at equilibrium, you will take away some form of community surplus. Right? The thing that we're going to do that is a little bit new is look at the effects of a tax, okay, on price, on quantity, okay, and then determine how much money a government is going to get. So if you can see this, I hope you can tell that our initial supply curve is in purple, our initial demand curve is in purple. When there's a tax instituted on a good, any good, we see the supply curve shift to the left. That creates a new equilibrium point. So we used to have equilibrium, okay, at this point here, what I've labeled in red, point Y, at price at equilibrium. Okay, now, okay, where we see point C here, okay, we see a new equilibrium point. We have a price at the tax. We know how much the tax is based on the vertical distance between the two supply lines. Okay? So that is labeled Y to X or X to Y. That's the amount of taxes, the vertical distance between the supply curve. So theoretically, if you had a completely vertical demand curve, perfectly inelastic, right, the distance between the supply lines would be the exact distance that you'd see with a change in price. And we'll get to that even later when we look at more elasticity. What you're looking at here, I know there's a lot of colors and a lot of different things, but what we're eventually going to try to figure out, and the last thing we'll talk about, is how do we figure out government revenue? Well, if total revenue is price times quantity, government revenue is simply the tax times quantity. Right, so we know when we have this new equilibrium that we have a new quantity. Okay? So that's sum of, okay, our government revenue. Okay? The other part of government revenue is the amount of the tax. The amount of the tax is the vertical distance between the line, that's labeled from point A to point B right here. So this rectangle would represent the amount of revenue that government is collecting. Okay? It's the amount of the tax multiplied by the quantity. Okay? And that's for stuff that's coming up. We'll play around a lot with elasticity related to tax. We'll play around a lot with why a government might tax and whether that's effective or not. Thank you for listening.